Dr. Marcus Williams stood at the heart of the emergency room. The rhythmic beeping of machines and the hushed chaos of medical staff swirling around him like a symphony of urgency. He was a man of profound skill and dedication, his hands steady and precise as they worked to save lives. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, casting a stark glow over the scene, but Marcus remained unfazed. His focus was sharp. Every patient was a life worth saving. "Dr. Williams, we've got a GSW coming in. Critical," a nurse shouted, her voice slicing through the ambient noise. Adrenaline surged through him as he pivoted on his heel, already strategizing. Gunshot wounds were never straightforward, and the stakes were higher than ever. "Prep the ore. I'll meet you there," he replied, his tone authoritative yet calm, a contrast to the chaos surrounding him. He grabbed a pair of gloves, sliding them on with practiced efficiency, and made his way toward the operating room, his mind racing through the steps he would need to take to save this patient. As he entered the OR, the sterile smell of antiseptic filled his nostrils. The surgical team was already gathered, ready for his orders. He quickly assessed the situation, noting the severity of the wounds, the blood loss, and the patient's unstable vitals displayed on the monitor. If you're enjoying this video and want to see more content like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and activate the bell. That way, you won't miss any of our updates. Your support helps us bring you the best content possible. Continuing, "Let's move. We need to stabilize the hemorrhage first," Marcus commanded, his voice steady. The team sprung into action, instruments clattering as they prepared for the intricate procedure ahead. For the next hour, time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. Each incision, each stitch, was a testament to Marcus's skill and resolve. He was a maestro conducting a life-or-death performance, and every second counted. The patient's heart rate began to stabilize, and a sense of relief washed over him, though he knew better than to celebrate too soon. "Good job, everyone. Let's close him up," he said, his voice firm yet encouraging. The team worked seamlessly together, the rhythm of their movements a well-rehearsed dance. As they finished, Marcus stepped back, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Dr. Williams," a nurse called as they wheeled the patient away. "You've saved another one." Marcus nodded, feeling a familiar swell of pride mixed with exhaustion. It was moments like these that reminded him why he had chosen this path, despite the challenges he faced as a black surgeon in a predominantly white field. As he exited the OR, the ER buzzed with activity. He noticed a group of nurses gathered around a monitor, their expressions shifting from concern to shock. Curiosity piqued, he approached them. "What's going on?" he asked, his brow furrowing as he peered at the screen. "They're reporting a major accident on Highway 56. Multiple casualties," one of the nurses replied, her gaze flicking back to the screen. "Looks like it's going to be a long night." Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. Highway 56 was notorious for accidents, and the thought of multiple victims arriving at once was daunting. "Get the trauma team ready. We'll need all hands on deck," he instructed, his mind already running through the potential scenarios. Meanwhile, across town, Margaret Hayes was at a community event, the glittering gala highlighting the wealth and influence of the town's upper crust. She wore an elegant gown, her demeanor as polished as the diamonds adorning her neck. The room buzzed with laughter and conversation, but beneath the surface, a current of tension flowed. Margaret stood at the center of a small circle of acquaintances, her voice rising above the chatter as she shared her opinions. "I just don't understand why we keep letting them take over our neighborhoods. It's like we're just giving our town away," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. A young woman beside her shifted uncomfortably, glancing around for support. "Margaret, that's a bit harsh, don't you think?" she ventured, her voice hesitant. "Harsh? No, it's reality," Margaret snapped, her blue eyes narrowing. "They don't care about our community. They just want to take what we've built." This time someone said it out loud. The group fell silent, the atmosphere thickening with unease. Margaret's words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and those around her exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. "Maybe we should focus on inclusivity instead," another voice piped up, trying to steer the conversation away from the minefield of race. Inclusivity? You mean letting them in to ruin everything? Margaret shot back, her voice rising. I've worked too hard for my family's legacy to watch it go down the drain. This is a white town, and it should stay that way. A few people shifted uncomfortably, and one man cleared his throat. Margaret, you might want to consider that not everyone shares your views. It's a changing world. Margaret waved her hand dismissively, the flicker of anger in her eyes evident. Change? Change is overrated. Look where it's gotten us. The tension was palpable, and the small group began to break apart, some retreating to the buffet, others mingling with guests who were visibly uncomfortable with the conversation. Margaret, undeterred, continued to voice her opinions to anyone who would listen, her words more venomous as the night wore on. As she departed the event, her mind was a whirlwind of disdain and indignation. She didn't care what others thought. The world was changing too fast, and she was determined to hold on to the power and privilege she believed was rightfully hers. Just as Margaret's car turned onto the highway, Marcus received a call that would change everything. The trauma team was on high alert. A serious accident had occurred, and they were expecting multiple victims, including a woman trapped inside her vehicle. Marcus, it's a bad one. They're saying there's a woman in critical condition, potential head trauma. A colleague informed him over the phone. Marcus's heart raced. We need to prepare for the worst. Get the ready and call in the specialists. It's going to be a long night, he replied, his voice steady despite the anxiety churning in his stomach. He grabbed his coat and headed toward the trauma bay, determination etched onto his face. He knew that each life mattered, regardless of who they were or what they believed. As the ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, Marcus steeled himself for the challenges ahead. He could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, a mix of urgency and dread filling the air. The ER doors swung open, and the first gurney rolled in, paramedics shouting orders as they rushed to save the lives of those who had been caught in the chaos of the accident. Let's go, he shouted to his team, ready to dive once more into the fray, unaware that one of those lives was about to intersect with his in ways he could never have anticipated. The fluorescent lights of the operating room buzzed softly, casting a stark white glow over the sterile environment. Dr. Marcus Williams, a skilled surgeon with a calm demeanor, stood at the center of the chaos, surrounded by his dedicated team. They were all acutely aware of the urgency of the moment. Margaret Hayes lay on the operating table, her life hanging by a thread after the horrific car accident. Blood pooled beneath her, a stark reminder of the fragility of life. "Scalpel," Marcus called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. His mind raced, calculations and strategies flitting through his thoughts like a busy highway. He could feel the pressure from the ticking clock, but he had been in situations like this before. He pushed aside any personal feelings about the patient, her history, her beliefs, focusing solely on the task at hand. He was here to save a life, and that was his only priority. As he worked, the team moved in a synchronized manner, each member knowing their role. The anesthesiologist monitored Margaret's vital signs while the surgical nurse prepared the instruments. "Her blood pressure is dropping," she exclaimed, her voice tinged with urgency. "Increase the 4 fluids," Marcus instructed, his eyes fixed on the surgical site. He could feel the tension in the room, a palpable energy that thrummed like an electric current. The reality of who this woman was loomed in the back of his mind, but he pushed it away, focusing instead on the task that required every ounce of his expertise. Minutes felt like hours as they fought against time. The rhythm of their movements was almost choreographed, a dance of life and death. "Clamp!" Marcus shouted, his brow furrowing in concentration. His hands moved with precision, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. He could hear the faint beeping of the monitors, each sound a reminder of the stakes involved. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Marcus stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. "We've stabilized her," he announced, relief flooding through him. The tension in the room eased slightly, but the battle was far from over. Margaret was still unconscious, and the road to recovery would be long and uncertain. As the team began to clean up, Marcus took a moment to breathe, leaning against the counter for support. He thought about the challenges he faced as a black doctor in a predominantly white medical community. Despite his skills and dedication, there were always whispers, always sideways glances. He felt the weight of his skin color in every interaction, a burden he was accustomed to carrying but one that never truly became lighter. He remembered a recent conversation with a colleague, a white surgeon who had casually remarked, "Marcus, you're not like the others." The implication had stung, a reminder that he was still seen as an outsider, no matter how hard he worked or how many lives he saved. "I'm just trying to do my job," he had replied, forcing a smile. But the words had lingered, a bitter taste in his mouth. "Dr. Williams?" A nurse's voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see her looking at him expectantly. "The family is waiting for an update on Mrs. Hayes." "Right," he replied, shaking off his musings. He straightened his scrubs and walked out of the operating room, his mind still racing. He knew the family would be anxious. They had no idea what lay ahead for Margaret. He prepared himself for the questions, the concerns, and the inevitable moment when he would have to confront the reality of Margaret's prejudices. When Marcus reached the waiting area, he was greeted by a group of worried faces. Margaret's husband, a tall man with graying hair and a deeply creased forehead, stood in the middle, flanked by two adult children who looked as though they had aged a decade in the last few hours. The air was heavy with tension, and he could sense their desperation. "Doctor, how is she?" Margaret's husband asked, his voice trembling slightly. "She's stable for now," Marcus said, choosing his words carefully. "We were able to stop the bleeding and repair the damage. However, she will need time to recover, and there may be complications." "Complications?" One of the children echoed, panic creeping into her voice. "What kind of complications?" "Right now, it's too early to tell," he replied. "I understand this is difficult, but we'll monitor her closely. I'll keep you updated as we learn more." As he spoke, he could feel their eyes on him, the weight of their expectations pressing down. He was aware of the underlying tension. They likely didn't expect a black doctor to be the one to save her. He could see the flicker of disbelief in their gazes, an unspoken question hanging heavily in the air. "Thank you, Dr. Williams," Margaret's husband finally said, his voice steadying. "We appreciate everything you're doing." Marcus nodded, but as he walked away, a deep sense of unease settled in his chest. He had done his job. He had saved Margaret's life. Yet, he couldn't help but feel that the battle was just beginning. The complexities of their lives were intertwined now, and he would have to confront the reality of who she was once she awoke. Hours later, Marcus found himself in the recovery room, where Margaret lay, still unconscious but stable. The hum of the machines filled the space, a constant reminder of the thin line between life and death. He stood by her side, watching her chest rise and fall, the rhythm almost soothing. His mind wandered to the possibility of her waking up, to the inevitable confrontation that would follow. He wondered how she would react when she realized who had saved her. Suddenly, a soft groan escaped Margaret's lips, and her eyelids fluttered. Marcus's heart raced as he leaned closer, ready to provide reassurance. "Margaret, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Her eyes opened slowly, confusion clouding her gaze as she took in her surroundings. "Where am I?" she murmured, her voice hoarse. "You're in the hospital," Marcus said gently. "You were in an accident, but you're safe now." Margaret blinked, processing his words. Then, as recognition dawned, her eyes widened with disbelief. "You," she spat, her voice filled with venom. "You're the one who operated on me?" "Yes, I am," Marcus replied, trying to maintain his composure despite the surge of emotions coursing through him. "I'm Dr. Williams. Why would you help me?" she demanded, anger flaring in her eyes. "I don't want a black man touching me, let alone saving my life." "Margaret, I did what I had to do to save you," he said firmly, fighting against the tide of her hatred. "Your life was on the line and I'm a surgeon. That's my job." "Your job?" she scoffed, her voice dripping with contempt. You think that just because you put on a white coat, you're somehow better than me? You're nothing but a... Enough, Marcus interrupted, his patience wearing thin. I didn't come here to argue with you. I came here to ensure that you recover. Margaret's face twisted with rage, her breathing quickening. You ruined my life. I don't want you to be responsible for my recovery. Get away from me. Marcus stepped back, his heart racing with frustration. You may not want me here, but I'm the one who has the expertise to help you recover. You'll have to rely on me whether you like it or not. With those words, he turned and walked out of the recovery room, leaving Margaret seething with anger. As he closed the door behind him, he felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination. This was just the beginning, and he knew that their paths were now irrevocably linked. He would have to confront not only her prejudices but also his own feelings about her, as their intertwined lives unfolded in ways neither of them could yet comprehend. As Margaret Hayes lay in her hospital bed, the sterile scent of antiseptic mingled uncomfortably with her rising fury. The monitors beeped rhythmically, an irritating reminder of her vulnerability, and she could feel the remnants of pain coursing through her body. The accident had left her battered, but it was the realization of who had saved her that ignited a deeper rage within her. Dr. Marcus Williams had been the one to pull her back from the brink of death, and the thought twisted in her stomach like a knife. He was everything she despised. A black man in a position of authority, her savior in a moment of weakness. It felt like a betrayal, a mockery of all the beliefs she held dear. With a sharp intake of breath, she steeled herself for their inevitable confrontation. When Marcus entered the room, his demeanor was calm and professional, his dark eyes scanning her chart before he met her gaze. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes. How are you feeling today?" His voice was smooth, but it held an undercurrent of caution as if he were bracing for the storm. Margaret's eyes narrowed, and she pushed herself up slightly, wincing at the pain. "How do you think I feel? You ruined my life," she spat, her voice laced with venom. "You shouldn't have been the one to operate on me. You're not even qualified to save someone like me." Marcus took a step back, surprised by the intensity of her accusation. "I assure you, Mrs. Hayes, I'm more than qualified. I saved your life because that's what a doctor does, regardless of race or background." She scoffed, her lips curling in disdain. "Is that supposed to make me feel better? You're telling me that you, someone who doesn't belong in my world, were the only one who could help me? That's absurd." "Margaret," he said, his tone softening as he tried to reach her. "I understand that this is difficult for you, but I'm here to help you recover, not to harm you. Your prejudice is not going to change the fact that I was the one who saved you. Don't call me by my first name. You don't have that right." Margaret turned her head away, staring out the window as if the sight of the world outside could erase the reality of her situation. She could hear the distant sounds of life continuing beyond her hospital room, the laughter of children, the hum of conversation, the normalcy she longed to reclaim. For a moment, silence enveloped them, thick and suffocating. Marcus stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, trying to maintain his composure amidst her hostility. "I'll be your doctor for the next few days, and I recommend we focus on your recovery," he finally said, his voice steady. "Recovery? You think I can recover with you watching me? I'd rather die," she shouted, her anger rising again, but deep inside, beneath the layers of her hatred, there was a flicker of fear about her own mortality, a realization that her life could have ended in that crash. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "That's not a decision I can make for you, but I encourage you to reconsider. There's still much to live for, and I want to help you find that." Margaret glared at him, her chest heaving. "There is nothing you can say that will change how I feel. You think because you saved me, you can somehow earn my respect? You're nothing but a what?" He interrupted, his voice rising slightly in frustration. "A black surgeon? A man who dedicated his life to saving others? You view me through the lens of your prejudice, and that's your own flaw, not mine." After a moment, Margaret looked away, the anger in her eyes faltering as uncertainty crept in. She had always held firm to her beliefs, but now they felt as fragile as the bandages around her wounds. She hated him, but a part of her was beginning to understand just how deeply her hatred ran and how it had shaped her life. Days passed, and each interaction with Marcus was fraught with tension. As her body began to heal, her spirit remained stubbornly resistant. He would enter her room, check her vitals, and discuss her recovery plan, but Margaret would deflect his attempts to connect with her. One afternoon, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, when Marcus walked in with a clipboard in hand. "Your recovery is going well, and I'd like to start you on physical therapy," he said, glancing up to meet her gaze. "Physical therapy?" she echoed, her voice dripping with disdain. "What's the point? I'll never be whole again. Not after this." "You will be whole again, Margaret. It will take time and effort, but it's possible," he replied, his tone firm yet encouraging. "You just have to be willing to work for it." "I'm not willing to work with you," she shot back, crossing her arms defiantly. "I'd rather suffer than accept help from someone like you." "Why do you keep saying that? Someone like me?" Marcus pressed, frustration creeping into his voice. "Why does my skin color matter in this context?" "Because it does," she retorted, her voice rising again. "It matters to me, and it matters to you. You can pretend all you want that we're on equal footing, but we're not. You're a black man in a white world, and I'm a white woman who doesn't need your help." Marcus inhaled deeply, striving to maintain his composure. "You need to confront your biases, Margaret. This anger you're holding on to isn't just about me. It's about you. It's about the beliefs you've clung to for so long. You're not just rejecting me. You're rejecting an opportunity for growth." Margaret fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. She turned her head away, refusing to acknowledge the truth in them. As much as she wanted to dismiss him, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. Deep down, she sensed the cracks in her worldviews beginning to form. Days turned into a week, and during a particularly tense session, Marcus brought up a new subject. "I learned something today that might interest you," he said, his voice steady. "You have a daughter, don't you? I've heard she's been estranged from you for some time." Margaret's eyes flashed with anger. "You have no right to talk about my family," she snapped, the defensiveness creeping back in. "I'm not trying to pry," Marcus replied, maintaining his calm. "But I believe your relationship with her is a reflection of your beliefs. If you're willing to confront your racism, it could open doors for healing in your family." Margaret's expression softened, though she quickly masked it with irritation. "You don't know anything about my family. You don't know anything about me." "Perhaps," he conceded. "But I do know that holding on to hate only perpetuates more hate. You have a chance to change that, both for yourself and for your daughter." As the days continued to stretch out, Marcus's words lingered in Margaret's mind. She found herself replaying their conversations, the anger steadily giving way to a complex web of emotions. She had always believed she was right, that her views were justified, but Marcus's unwavering presence forced her to confront the uncomfortable truths she had buried deep within. With each interaction, Margaret felt the walls she had built around herself beginning to crack. The realization that her daughter might disapprove of her beliefs, that she might have lost her because of them, gnawed at her insides. And as she lay in her hospital bed, the sterile walls surrounding her, she couldn't help but wonder if there was still time to change, to seek redemption before it was too late. Dr. Marcus Williams stood in the hospital's break room, staring blankly at the wall, lost in thought. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a harsh glare on his features. He was usually energized after a long shift, but today felt different. The weight of Margaret Hayes's animosity hung heavily on him like a thick fog. He had saved her life, yet she regarded him as the enemy. The irony was suffocating. He had been trained to save lives without prejudice, yet her hatred was palpable, even in her fragile state. As he sipped his lukewarm coffee, his mind wandered to the upcoming community meeting. He had been invited as a speaker to address racial issues that had been stirring unrest in their small town. Past experiences echoed in his mind, reminding him of the hostility he had faced in this very community. Marcus felt a knot tighten in his stomach, He was hesitant, unsure if speaking out would do more harm than good. What if his words only fueled the flames of Margaret's vitriol? But, he reminded himself, silence would only perpetuate the cycle of hatred. Meanwhile, in her hospital room, Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, fuming. She could hear snippets of conversations outside her door, people discussing the upcoming meeting. He's going to talk about race and the community, one nurse said, her tone laced with curiosity. Another voice chimed in, I hope he knows what he's getting into. The mere thought of Marcus speaking out made Margaret's blood boil. How dare he try to undermine her influence? She had built her status through sheer will and determination, and now it felt threatened by a black doctor who had no right to challenge her authority. Margaret's thoughts spiraled into a dark place where she felt justified in her animosity. He's just trying to make a name for himself, she muttered under her breath, her fingers tapping restlessly on the arm of the chair. The anger she felt was a shield against the vulnerability that lay beneath. She had spent years cultivating an image of control and superiority, and the idea of losing that to someone she had always seen as beneath her was unbearable. Later that evening, Marcus found himself pacing in his tiny apartment, rehearsing his thoughts for the speech. The cluttered space was a reflection of his mind. Books on medicine and race theory were scattered around, alongside personal items that told stories he wasn't ready to articulate. He glanced at the mirror, confronting his reflection. You can do this, he whispered, trying to instill confidence in himself. You owe it to the community. But as he prepared, a part of him wondered if it was worth the potential backlash, especially from Margaret. The next day, the community center was buzzing with anticipation. Local residents filtered in, creating an atmosphere thick with varying opinions. As Marcus took his place at the front, he noticed Margaret sitting in the back, her arms crossed tightly, a scowl etched on her face. He felt a shiver run down his spine, but he steadied himself, knowing this was his moment to speak his truth. Thank you all for coming, he began, his voice resonating in the large room. I stand before you today not just as a surgeon, but as a member of this community, one that is deeply divided by race and prejudice. He glanced at Margaret, whose eyes narrowed in disdain. We need to confront these issues head-on if we ever hope to heal and move forward. As he spoke, Marcus felt the tension in the room shift. Some people nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. We cannot ignore the injustices that persist, he continued, his passion rising. Racism is not just a historical problem. It is alive and thriving in our community. If we want to build a better future, we must challenge our biases and support one another. Margaret's hands clenched into fists as she listened. The words Marcus spoke felt like arrows aimed directly at her heart. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, threatening to boil over. Who does he think he is? She thought, her mind racing with indignation. He's just trying to stir up trouble. As Marcus concluded his speech, a mix of murmurs filled the room. Some applauded, while others expressed their discontent. He felt a sense of accomplishment, but it was overshadowed by the sight of Margaret storming out before he could even take a breath. The door swung shut with a loud bang, echoing the turmoil that had just unfolded. After the meeting, Marcus stepped outside, hoping to clear his head. He was met by a cool breeze, but the chill didn't quite reach his heart. Suddenly, he felt a presence behind him. He turned to find Margaret standing there, her expression a mixture of fury and desperation. Marcus, she called, her voice sharp and demanding. You need to take back what you said in there. He took a moment to process her words, the challenge hanging in the air between them. Margaret, I can't do that. I spoke the truth. We need to face these issues, not hide from them. Her eyes blazed with intensity. You think your words are going to change anything? You're just a black surgeon trying to play the victim card. This is my town. I built my name here, and I won't let you destroy it. Destroy it? Marcus echoed, incredulous. I'm not trying to destroy anything. I'm trying to build a bridge we can all walk across. But it's not going to happen if you continue to hold on to your prejudices. Margaret stepped closer, her voice trembling with emotion. "You don't understand what it's like for someone like me. I've had to work harder than anyone else to get where I am. You think you can just come in and tell me how to live?" "I didn't come here to tell you how to live," Marcus replied, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "I came here to show you that there's another way, but it requires vulnerability, something you seem afraid of." Her face flushed with anger and something else. "Fear, perhaps? You think you know me? You don't know anything about my life, my struggles." Her voice cracked, revealing a hint of the pain buried beneath her bravado. "No, I don't," he admitted, softening his tone. "But I'm willing to listen, if you'd let me. We're not so different, you and I. We both have our battles to fight." For a moment, the air between them shifted, the tension giving way to something more profound. Marcus could see the flicker of uncertainty in Margaret's eyes, as if she were grappling with a truth she had long tried to suppress. But before he could say more, she turned abruptly, her vulnerability retreating behind the facade of anger. "Stay out of my life, Marcus," she said, her voice low and menacing. "You have no idea what you're asking." As she walked away, Marcus felt a mix of frustration and sadness. He had pushed her, but perhaps too hard. He wanted her to see the potential for change, but she was still trapped in her fear. The confrontation had revealed their vulnerabilities, but it also highlighted the chasm that lay between them, a chasm that seemed insurmountable at the moment. He took a deep breath, watching her silhouette disappear into the distance. The battle was far from over, and he knew that this was just the beginning of a tumultuous journey for both of them. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden hue over the small town, Marcus Williams sat in his office, reviewing his notes for the upcoming speech. The room was quiet except for the occasional rustle of paper and the distant beeping of medical equipment. He was well aware that his words would carry weight, not just for himself, but for the community that had long been divided by deep-seated prejudices. Just as he was lost in thought, a soft knock interrupted his concentration. The door creaked open, revealing a young woman with striking similarities to Margaret, her mother. Her hair was a wild cascade of curls, and her eyes held a mix of determination and sorrow. It was Sophia Hayes, Margaret's estranged daughter. "Dr. Williams?" she asked hesitantly, stepping inside. "Ms. Hayes," he replied, setting his notes aside. "What brings you here?" Sophia took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I wanted to talk to you about my mother. I know things haven't been easy since the accident." Marcus nodded, aware that the tension between him and Margaret had only escalated since her awakening. "It's been challenging. I can only imagine," Sophia said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I want you to know that I'm disappointed in her, disappointed in what she stands for. I've distanced myself because of her beliefs, and it breaks my heart to see her like this." "Your mother is in a vulnerable place," Marcus replied, leaning back in his chair. "She's angry, scared, and grappling with her own prejudices." "Vulnerable?" Sophia scoffed, her frustration spilling over. "She's had years to confront those beliefs. I can't believe she's still clinging to them." "You have to stand firm in your speech, Dr. Williams. It's important for the community to hear this. Don't let her sway you." Marcus studied the young woman before him, recognizing the pain etched across her features. "I appreciate your support, Sophia, but I also need to consider the ramifications of what I say. It's not just about her. It's about everyone in this town. Each person who has been affected by racism." Sophia stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. "Exactly, and that's why it's crucial. You have a chance to make a difference, to challenge the status quo. Don't let her anger stop you." "Your mother's anger is just one part of this," Marcus said softly. "I can't ignore her humanity. I can't reduce her to her prejudices, no matter how deeply they run." Sophia's expression softened slightly, but a flicker of frustration remained. "I understand, but she has to face the truth. If you can help her see it, maybe there's hope for her yet." As they spoke, Marcus felt a surge of empathy for Sophia. Her struggle to reconcile her love for her mother with her disdain for her beliefs mirrored his own journey. "I will do my best," he promised, But change takes time, and it often requires uncomfortable conversations. Sophia nodded, her resolve returning. That's all I ask. Just don't back down. I have to believe there's a chance for her to change, for our family to heal. With a final nod, Sophia turned to leave, her footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. Marcus watched her go, feeling a sense of weight settle on his shoulders. He was about to confront not only a woman who had openly espoused hate, but also the complexities of human relationships and the potential for understanding in the most unlikely circumstances. The day of the speech arrived, and the community center buzzed with an anxious energy. Chairs were filled with locals, some curious, others skeptical, and a few openly hostile. Marcus stood backstage, his heart racing as he rehearsed his words in his mind. He could almost hear the whispers of doubt that had plagued him since the moment he agreed to speak. Dr. Williams, a familiar voice called, breaking through his thoughts. It was Nurse Angela, her smile brightening the room. You're going to do great. Just remember, you're not alone in this. Thanks, Angela, he replied, grateful for her support. As he stepped onto the stage, the murmurs quieted. He scanned the audience, noting Margaret sitting in the front row, her expression unreadable. The sight of her sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He took a deep breath, grounding himself before beginning. Thank you all for being here today, he started, his voice steady. I stand before you not just as a surgeon, but as a member of this community. A community that has been torn apart by prejudice and fear. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. We've seen divisions deepen. We've watched as hate has taken root in our hearts, poisoning our relationships and our understanding of one another. It's time to confront these issues head-on. As he spoke, he noticed Margaret's posture shift. She leaned forward, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was a small sign, but it gave him hope. I believe in healing, Marcus continued, his voice rising with passion. Not just of the body, but of the spirit. To heal, we must first acknowledge the wounds we've inflicted upon one another. We must ask ourselves difficult questions and challenge our own beliefs. He glanced at Margaret, who was now visibly shaken. Racism is not just a word. It's a lived experience. It's a barrier that separates us, causing pain and suffering for those who are marginalized. But it doesn't have to remain this way. We have the power to change the narrative. The audience was captivated, some nodding in agreement while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus pressed on, feeling a surge of conviction. It starts with acknowledging our biases and understanding that change begins within us. We must strive for empathy, for compassion. It's not easy, but it is necessary. As he concluded his speech, the room erupted into applause. Marcus's heart swelled with a mix of relief and pride. He had done what he set out to do. He had spoken his truth, and for the first time he felt a glimmer of hope in the air. As the applause died down, Marcus stepped off the stage, adrenaline coursing through him. He spotted Margaret, who was still seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He approached her cautiously, unsure of how she would react. Margaret, he began, his voice low. I hope what I said resonated with you. She looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You challenged me, she admitted, her voice quivering. I've never had anyone speak to me like that before. Change is uncomfortable, Marcus replied, his heart racing. But it's also necessary. You have the power to change, to confront those beliefs that have held you captive. Margaret's expression shifted, a mixture of anger and confusion crossing her face. You think I can just change? It's not that simple. I know it's not, he said gently, but acknowledging the need for change is the first step. You can start by examining why you hold those beliefs. What fear lies beneath them? She fell silent, staring at the floor. I've spent so long in my own bubble, surrounded by people who think like me. It's all I know. Then it's time to step outside that bubble, Marcus urged, taking a small step closer. You have the chance to redefine who you are, Margaret. You can strive for understanding instead of hate. Margaret looked up, her expression softening for the first time. I don't know if I can. It feels insurmountable. We all have to start somewhere, he replied, his voice steady. You have a choice. You can either cling to those beliefs that isolate you or reach out and learn from others. The choice is yours. As they stood there, the weight of their conversation hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Marcus felt a flicker of hope ignite within him, a belief that perhaps, just perhaps, this moment could mark the beginning of a profound transformation for both of them. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the small town of Maplewood. The air was thick with tension, as whispers of scandal spread like wildfire. Dr. Marcus Williams sat in his office, poring over the details of a recent investigation he had been discreetly conducting. It was a scandal that involved Margaret Hayes, the very woman whose life he had saved just weeks before. The revelation felt like a dagger, twisting in his gut. He had fought to save her, only to discover that she had played a part in something that had caused suffering for others, particularly in the Black community. As Marcus flipped through the files, the memories of his last encounter with Margaret flooded his mind. Her anger and prejudice had been palpable, but there was something deeper lurking beneath her surface, a vulnerability that was hard to ignore. He sighed, knowing that confronting her would not only be difficult but necessary. He needed to expose the truth not just for his own sense of justice, but for the community that had suffered because of her actions. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the hospital, the weight of his discovery heavy on his shoulders. He walked through the bustling corridors, nodding to nurses and doctors, his mind racing. He had decided to confront Margaret that day. As he approached her room, he could hear her voice, sharp and bitter, arguing with the nurse. "I don't need any more of your pity," Margaret snapped, her voice laced with disdain. "Just get me a real doctor." Marcus paused at the door, his heart pounding. The last remnants of sympathy he had felt for her began to crumble, replaced by a resolve that had become all too familiar. He pushed the door open, stepping inside the room. "Good morning, Margaret," he said, his voice calm but firm. She turned to him, her expression shifting from irritation to surprise. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her eyes narrowing. "Aren't you supposed to be in some important meeting or something?" "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something important," he replied, closing the door behind him. He could feel the tension crackling in the air. "I've come across some information regarding your involvement with the Johnson case." Margaret's face paled, a flicker of fear crossing her features before she masked it with anger. "That's none of your business, Dr. Williams. You're a surgeon, not some community watchdog. It is my business when your actions have consequences that ripple through this community," he pressed, stepping closer. "Your discriminatory practices have harmed a Black-owned business. People are suffering because of it," she scoffed, crossing her arms defiantly. "You think you can come in here and lecture me? Do you have any idea who I am? Do you have any idea who you're hurting?" Marcus shot back, his voice rising with frustration. "You've built your life on the backs of others, Margaret. This isn't about power. This is about accountability." The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Margaret stared at him, her expression a mixture of defiance and something softer. Fear, perhaps. "You don't understand," she finally said, her voice trembling. "I did what I thought was best for my family, for my business." "And at what cost?" Marcus challenged. "You've ostracized an entire community. You've lost sight of what's right." Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a moment, Marcus saw the woman beneath the layers of prejudice and entitlement. "I was raised to believe certain things," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's all I've ever known. That doesn't excuse your actions, Margaret," he said gently, his tone softening, "but it can be the first step towards change. You can choose to be better." She looked away, her gaze fixed on the window, where the sunlight struggled to penetrate the clouds. "I don't know if I can," she confessed, her voice cracking. "What if I lose everything?" "You might," Marcus replied honestly, "but what you could gain is far more valuable. You could gain the respect of this community, the chance to rebuild your life on a foundation of integrity." Margaret turned to him, her expression shifting from anger to a vulnerability he had not seen before. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice low. "You've already won. You saved my life. Isn't that enough?" "No," he said firmly. "I want you to acknowledge what you've done and to take responsibility. I want you to help heal the wounds you've inflicted." As their eyes locked, he saw a flicker of something, a realization, perhaps, that this confrontation was as much about her as it was about him. The journey of healing, he understood, was often a path lined with thorns. Days turned into weeks, and the community began to respond to the revelations surrounding Margaret's actions. Protests erupted outside her lavish home, chants echoing through the streets. "Justice for Johnsons," they cried, the anger palpable. Margaret, once a figure of authority and influence, now stood isolated, a pariah in her own town. Marcus watched from a distance, his heart heavy, but his resolve stronger than ever. He had continued to advocate for the Johnson family and had become a voice for those who had been silenced. At community meetings, he spoke passionately about the need for inclusivity and respect, and gradually the community began to rally around him. One evening, after a particularly heated meeting, he returned to his office, exhausted but fulfilled. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Margaret, looking worn and vulnerable, her once pristine appearance now marred by the toll of public scrutiny. "Can I come in?" she asked hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," Marcus replied, motioning for her to take a seat. He watched as she settled into the chair, her hands trembling slightly. "I've been thinking a lot," she began, her eyes downcast. "About everything. About you, about what I've done." And, he prompted gently, sensing a shift in her demeanor. "I want to make things right," she said, her voice stronger now. "I can't take back the past, but I want to help the Johnsons. I want to support their business, to make amends in any way I can." Marcus felt a rush of emotions. Surprise, hope, but also caution. "That's a good start, Margaret, but it has to be genuine. The community needs to see that you're committed to change." "I know," she replied, determination flickering in her eyes. "I want to hold a fundraiser, to support them publicly, to show that I'm willing to change. I want to be part of the solution, not the problem." He studied her for a moment, weighing her words. "It won't be easy. There will be backlash, and some may never forgive you." "I understand that," she said, her voice steady. "But I can't live in denial anymore. I need to confront my past. And this is the first step." Marcus nodded slowly, a sense of cautious optimism blooming within him. "If you're truly committed, I'll help you. But you have to be prepared for the consequences." "I am," she affirmed, her gaze unwavering. "I'm ready to face them." As they began to discuss the details of the fundraiser, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this was the beginning of something transformative. Not just for Margaret, but for the entire community. It would take time and the road would be fraught with challenges. But for the first time, the possibility of healing felt tangible. In the weeks that followed, as Margaret worked tirelessly to organize the event, the town began to shift. Conversations about race and accountability filled the air, sparking discussions that had long been buried. Slowly, the community started to come together, united in a shared purpose. On the day of the fundraiser, the atmosphere was electric. The venue was packed, filled with people eager to support the Johnsons and witness Margaret's public apology. Marcus stood at the front, his heart pounding as he watched Margaret take the stage. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice trembling but resolute. "I stand before you today to acknowledge my mistakes, to recognize the pain I've caused, and to ask for your forgiveness." The crowd listened, a palpable tension in the air. As she recounted her journey of understanding, the room grew quieter. She spoke of her prejudices, of the blinders she had worn for so long, and of the realization that true strength came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. By the time she finished, tears glistened in her eyes. "I am committed to making amends, to supporting this community, and to ensuring that what happened to the Johnsons never happens again." The applause that followed was hesitant at first but grew stronger, echoing through the room. It was a start, an imperfect start, but a start nonetheless. Marcus felt a swell of pride and hope as he joined in the applause, knowing that change was possible, even amidst the scars of the past. As the evening wore on, Marcus received accolades for his efforts, his voice amplifying the call for change. It was a bittersweet moment. He knew that healing would be a long process, but each step taken was a step toward a better future. Margaret, standing alongside him, looked transformed. No longer the powerful woman who had once wielded her influence like a weapon, but rather a woman seeking redemption. The journey ahead would be challenging, but they were both committed to facing it head-on. If you like the content, don't forget to leave a like, a comment, and share it with your friends. Your comment is essential for the growth of the channel. And look at this video that appears on the screen. See you soon.